Let me start us in a prayer and we'll get going. God, thank you for the opportunity to study your word, to dig in, to learn, to hear from each other, and to be challenged by you. God, speak through my teaching and preparation. May it be you who shines through and speaks to us tonight. And we pray all this in the name of Christ. Amen. Okay, so we're continuing our study on justice called Let It Roll Down, What Justice Means in the Bible and for Us. Theme verse, one of the theme verses, kind of being Micah 6:8, which is what you see on the decorative sign there, do justly, love mercy, walk humbly. To do at least a very minimal review. So last week we did a little bit more of a survey and read some of these larger, more well-known verses in Jesus in Matthew 23:23, talking about justice, mercy, and faithfulness, which is kind of his reference to Micah 6:8. We did a lot of rapid fire verses to kind of see what exactly the kind of things they're talking about in those verses. I like to share this word cloud that was given to me years ago. It shows you the different kinds of virtues that are talked about in the Bible, and the bigger the word, the more it is talked about in the Bible. And the only virtue that shows up more than justice in the Bible is love. So both of those are right on up there. And we also talked about all the passages that we read. I pointed out 4 things that I wanted you to notice about all of those passages that deal with justice and mention the word. It's all over the place. Every major part of the Bible, it is covered. It is not, when the Bible talks about this, at least the word I was using, it was not retribution or what we might call the justice system. It is very much real life stuff. It talked about things like bribery and wage theft, and things that affect real people's lives on a pretty large scale. And when we talk about doing justice, we see in these verses that it's not just about helping, it is addressing why people need help in the first place. One of the quotes we kind of muddled over and discussed was Dom Helder Camara, who said, "When I feed the hungry, they call me a saint. When I ask why people are hungry, they call me a communist." And he was Archbishop in Brazil. So now I want us to look at a passage that is very much about justice. It just doesn't necessarily use the word over and over. Sorry for this graphic, but just try to splash up something on the theme here. The book of Nehemiah is where we're going to be. We probably don't spend a whole lot of time in this book, usually in churches, but Nehemiah was the cup builder to King Artaxerxes of the Persian Empire, and he was allowed to go back and help the Jewish people rebuild. So let's get a little bit of a timeline here. So I'm sure this is hard to read, especially if you have a small screen. But this is kind of a historical timeline of the Old Testament of the Jewish people. Kind of shows you where on the timeline in the BC era some of these people showed up. And if you look, I think you can see my mouse. If you look right here in the purple area, kind of near the middle of it, that's Ezra and Nehemiah. And you see the key here is that that's when they returned to Israel to live as a province within the Persian Empire, and the Second Temple period starts. So you end up with Jesus lived at what ended up being the very end of the Second Temple period, because the Second Jerusalem Temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Roughly 500 years after Ezra and Nehemiah. So they are in the period after the Babylonian exile, which is in red here, and you see it places the name Daniel right there. So Ezra and Nehemiah, after that, they've been allowed to return, rebuild, and this is kind of, so that this is under the Persian Empire. Like I said, it shows you the blue and the orange show you where kind of the dual kingdoms were. before they were conquered and overthrown at different times. And then the black outline there, obviously a much smaller area, was the province of Judea, where the Israelites were allowed to return to. It includes the city of Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Jericho and Bethel, but obviously much less land. So one part of Nehemiah here as a little bit of background. So the whole book gives you some context, but some important context here in the second chapter of Nehemiah, verses 1 through 6. If anyone can see that well enough to read it and would like to unmute and read that for us.
In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors were buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah where my ancestors are buried so I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take? When will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time.
All right, thank you, Tom. So as I said, Nehemiah was a cupbearer to the king. Now that sounds strange to us, but these people were high-ranking, and they often served drinks and things for the king's gatherings and these important parties and things like that. And as I understand, they also had a role in making sure the king was not poisoned by someone. You gotta make sure you do that. So they were trusted. They were trusted. They were high-ranking. And so this is kind of, Nehemiah is a Jew serving kind of their Persian rulers in a high-ranking position. This was an empire that allowed the Jewish people to exist, gave them part of their historic land back, but that did not mean that they didn't face threats. And as Nehemiah is talking about here, because this was a time when everybody was always fighting everybody. They still needed some rebuilding, and so Nehemiah puts in this request to the king to go back and help with that, and he ends up being appointed governor of this. Let me go back. Governor of this province of Yehud. That's just Yehud is just the Hebrew version of Judea. He ends up being governor, the Persian appointed governor of that territory. So he is allowed to leave where he was, which was Susa, and go to the Jerusalem area. And this would have been his journey. That's not close. That's going all across modern day Syria and then some. So he had a ways to go. He goes back to his homeland and stays there as an appointed governor. So he has some authority there, and his main purpose for going back is to help them rebuild the walls, especially in the area of Jerusalem, to protect against enemies. Not to keep desperate people out, mind you. This is not that kind of wall building. This is to protect them from enemies in the age of ancient warfare. So now we go to the main part of the story that I want us to read. We're going to be in Nehemiah 5, verses 1 through 12. I have these diverse verses divided up among 3 slides. Is there someone else who's willing to unmute and read at least this first part for us?
I can read it. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields and vineyards and our homes to get grain during the famine." Still others were saying, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others."
Okay, you're going to keep going, Kyle. You're doing such a good job.
Okay. When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, "You are charging your own people interest." So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, "As far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your own people only for them to be sold back to us." They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, "What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies?"
All right, thank you. I'll finish it up. So he says, "I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain, but let us stop charging interest. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest you are charging them, 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil. We will give it back," they said, "and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say." Then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised. So let's review a little bit and point out a few things about this passage. So what happens here? It says there's a great outcry. They were saying, we're having trouble getting food. Others are saying we're having to mortgage our fields, vineyards, and homes just to eat during this famine. Others saying we've had to borrow money just to pay our required taxes. And then, although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews and our children, we've even had to sell our children into slavery.
We're having trouble getting food.
I'm getting, Lloyd or Sally, I'm getting background noise from one of your phones there.
Had to borrow money to pay our
It sounds like my own voice, actually. Okay, I will. I'll mute them for now. If you guys can hear me, sorry. There was some kind of echo. So they said. So Nehemiah hears this. They're in the midst of building the wall, we assume. He hears this and it says he's very angry. You're charging your own people interest. There are a couple of Torah commands against doing that. As far as possible, we've bought back our fellow Jews sold to the Gentiles. Now we're selling our own people. So this is kind of a intra-Jewish quarrel here. And he says, what you're doing is not right. Stop charging interest. Stop making it so that people who are already poor and living off the land don't have what they need, are having to give up everything, what little they already have, to just pay taxes or whatnot and to get by. And he kind of demands in this public assembly that they give it back. And we will not demand anything more from them, these people who are already poor and struggling. So a couple of things to highlight. Says we must get grain, eat and stay alive, we must get grain. It's possible that they were having to neglect their fields to help with the temple rebuilding. You know, we're not sure. It seems to indicate that this was also happening at the same time. Hang on one second. It talks about the king's tax. Now, taxes have always been a thing. You know, I guess that's one reason they say death and taxes you can always count on. The king's tax, this was rarely used to benefit the populace. In fact, the Persians actually took a lot of the coins from taxes and melted them down to be stored as bullion. So in other words, they would take tax dollars and just further enrich themselves, which of course only happened in ancient times. Then this part, he talks about charging your own people interest. It's an interesting translation choice. The phrase more accurately seems to refer to putting something, or in these days, someone, up as collateral. So maybe the closest modern day thing is think title loans. It wasn't just interest, it was they were putting even their own children up as collateral just so they could get the money they need to get by. From their own people was one of the big problems here. And then notice Nehemiah kind of mentions skin that he has in the game also. He says, I and my brothers and my men are also lending, but let us stop charging interest. And again, it's that same word. Another word is used throughout the Hebrew Bible. This seems to be, like I said, collateral. So that's kind of a summary of this scene of Nehemiah who goes back to rebuild, and the people, he kind of hears and notices what's going on with the people and the hardship they're facing at the hands of their own countrymen, let's say. And they kind of have this public assembly, and there's these demands to make it right. Okay. So stop for discussion here. So far, give me some feedback on what's happening here. What's the significance of what Nehemiah is saying and doing, and or why the large public gathering?
Well, it sounds like they're selling their own people.
Yep, that was happening, or at least that finding themselves in a position where they had nothing else to put up as collateral against a loan except their own children in some cases.
And I can understand why there'd be a large outcry.
Mm-hmm.
And I can imagine if somebody was selling our children.
First of all, I think it seemed like as much as we might be outraged about the selling and using children and each other as collateral, that it was a common practice. But Nehemiah, as a leader, calls a meeting together and just to say that this practice has got to stop, and I'm going to stop doing it too. See, I'm doing it. I'm lending money. I'm doing these things that I'm telling you that we shouldn't be doing, and it needs to stop. So I need you guys to follow. I need for you guys to stop doing this, because that's only the way that we as a people are going to make it. And I see it as top-down leadership. Top down is the top is saying this is what we're going to do, and the rest are following suit. Just like it was in reverse, the top was charging interest and taking collateral, so I'm going to do it too when I loan money. So I think it's something that we lack today in our leadership, The top down is going to do the right thing and demand of the people to do the right thing.
Okay. Yeah, so part of what you're observing there is that it matters when the people in power um, set the example and are the
Yes.
ones to call attention to something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other observations? All right, so I see some interesting parallels here with a subject that we talked about just today in the racial equity discussion. So if you've been looking at those emails, some of us at noon have been getting together to talk about the material that has been being sent out. And it just so happens that the material we discussed today and kind of most of what was included in yesterday's email was about being an ally to people of color. And in particular, it talks about if you have privilege in a situation or in a society, the idea of using your privilege to help and for the benefit of others who do not have the same voice or power or say so. Now, obviously, what's going on here with Nehemiah and the people is not about race, but there's a lot of interesting parallels here to what it means to do justice, and how to do justice can greatly depend on people with power, privilege, and influence using it in certain ways. I want to show you something from today. I meant to make these separate, but on the left side here, this was a screenshot from one of the articles that was sent out. It says, to be an ally is to take on the struggle as your own, transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who lack it, amplify voices of the oppressed before your own, acknowledge that even though you feel pain, the conversation is not about you, stand up even when you feel scared, own your mistakes and decenter yourself, and understand that your education is up to you and no one else. As one of these articles said, it means to be an ally, in this case, to people of color. But I'm curious, do you see parallels? And in what ways did Nehemiah do or not do these things that you see listed?
Now, he certainly took on the struggle as his own when he went to the king, and and then goes back. Um, and he's amplifying the voices of the oppressed. He's speaking up. Um, and I suspect he might have felt scared at some point.
Okay. Thank you, Tom.
I think also that looking at number 6, own your mistakes and decenter yourself. So even though it may have been the common practice at some point that children could be used as collateral, that certainly wasn't wise. And recognizing that as well as other practices during this time, he acknowledged the mistakes and then set the example of what are we going to do as a nation and how are we going to help and support each other. And I think that ties into number 7 also, that as leaders, as individuals, when we're trying to be allies, when we're trying to reconcile with others, that we have to take on that responsibility of educating and understanding a situation and not expecting the oppressed to always be the individual or persons that tell you what's going on. You need to step out and do the research and do the hard work yourself so that you have a clearer understanding.
Yeah. Thank you, Marcia. Any other observations you want to throw out?
Just that it wasn't a backroom deal,
Right.
the free sunshine laws or whatever, it was out in the open for all to see.
Right. Yeah. And like one of my questions earlier was, what is it that makes that significant?
That they were going to be held to it because it was public.
Yeah. So that's one thing it does, is it kind of holds you to the deal.
And it kind of shows that they're trying to make amends.
And it also strikes me that, if you're one of the, many people suffering because of what's going on, something tells me that it wasn't the first time that they were complaining. Something tells me this was not the first time that they were maybe trying to or wanting to call attention to what was going on, but they just don't have a lot of power on their own. And they needed an ally who was in a better position to do something, and who was willing to look at number 3, amplify their voices. He kind of calls this public meeting so that the people who could do something about this heard them and saw them, making it so that they're not just out of sight, out of mind, because that's one easy way to just kind of go about what we're doing. So I want to, again, some of this might sound vaguely familiar for those of you who have a good memory and came to summer Bible studies last summer in 2019. I'm doing a little bit of the repeat of the material here, but so what exactly does this look like in practice? And better yet, we might be able to think of examples, but do we know what it looks like for a group of believers to actually do something like this, to amplify voices, to take on a struggle, to call a public meeting and call the people in power to account, to be accountable to those they're supposed to serve, those they're supposed to be a part of and sharing a community with? Well, as I've shared previously, I've been involved in efforts where it was primarily people of faith who were organizing and coming together and bringing enough people together to have a voice to affect change in some way, to do justice in a way like this, and amplify voices. And I happen to have this on tape from at least 1 year. So I'd like to show you a few minutes of a clip from a public gathering that we hosted. This was a 20 church coalition for doing justice in the community. And we had every year what we called a Nehemiah Action Assembly. Now, given what we've read so far, I hope you can guess why we called it that. It's actually modeled after this chapter in Nehemiah. What Nehemiah did, why he did it, how he did it. And the clip that you're going to see is from our Nehemiah Action Assembly. This is from Kansas, so you're going to hear Kansas mentioned in this clip, and specifically Topeka. This clip is from a public rally where we were coming together to ask city leaders to establish an affordable housing trust fund and to do something about the substandard living conditions of people who were not making a living wage. So here is, actually I might need to do a new share to make sure you can hear my sound. One moment. I'll bring that back up and show you the clip. Hopefully.
Good job. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord. Topeka, jump one more time. Jump for justice. I'm so blessed to see all these people here, people that care about this community. I thank you for your time, for being out here to talk about safe and affordable housing and talk about the problem as we see it. It is encouraging to hear what the city of Topeka is doing for safe and affordable housing. The programs that help owner-occupied homes, people with mental health illnesses, and substance abuse meet a very serious need. Unfortunately, there are more low-income renter families than those who qualify for help. They struggle with affordability and with moving from one unsafe rental to the next. If you look closely at the housing stock in Topeka, on the outside, you'll see an issue of code compliance, such as peeling paint and overgrown weeds. But the underlying problem runs deeper. The truth is that thousands of families in Topeka lack safe and affordable housing. At a glance, it seems that housing in Topeka is affordable, but in reality, for low-income families, it is not. The National Low Income Housing Coalition found that in the state of Kansas, listen, in the state of Kansas, individuals need to make at least $14.34 an hour in order to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. In other words, someone would need to earn $31,000 a year. However, the average annual salaries for jobs fall short of that. For example, janitors earn $24,704. Nursing aides earn $26,376. Salespeople earn $24,310. Falls way short, doesn't it? In Topeka, that means in 2011, one of every 2 renter households spent more than 50% of their income on rent. Some families chose to pay more because they want something nicer, but there are 7,390 low-income families that do not have a choice. They are paying more than they can afford, and it's for substandard housing. People affected include families working full-time, young professionals just starting out, the elderly, people with disabilities, veterans, and anyone else on a fixed income. That's a lot of people, right? Amen. In all of those cases, it is easy to fall behind on rent and ultimately face eviction. In fact, our research interview with the Topeka Rescue Mission revealed a vicious cycle where families go from paying more than they can afford on rent to staying at the rescue mission and then back to substandard housing. Back to the rescue mission, back to the substandard housing. Yes, community partners are stepping in to help with the need. Topeka Housing Authority houses 4% of Topekans, and Cornerstone and Community Action are leasing affordable units. These existing programs are housing 2,000 families, and yet there are another 2,000 families on the wait list for Topeka Housing Authority and 5,390 other families that are still in need. This disparity is creating a crisis because not only are families struggling from month to month, they are renting units that are unsafe. Families that can only afford to pay $400 a month end up renting units that are in deep disrepair. Part of the problem stems from the fact that almost half of Topeka's housing stock was built before 1978. Over time, housing units need serious repairs, and yet landlords are leasing at a price at which they cannot afford to make repairs, or in some cases, are not willing to. As a result, the city estimates that 7,316 families earning less than $20,000 a year are living in units that have a lead hazard. And that 10,596 renter households have at least one unsafe housing condition, which according to the city of Topeka includes lead hazard, an unsafe walking surface, dilapidation of structure, unsanitary conditions, and threats to life and or safety. What I've just presented to you might seem like a lot of data, but please remember that these numbers represent your grandparents, your children, your mothers and fathers who experience safe and unaffordable every single day. We invite two people who are well acquainted with the need of these families.
My name is Jane Williams. I am a member of Trinity Presbyterian Church, and I am a Justice Ministry Network member. As an introduction, Sheila says that based on her personal experience working with families through the school system, she believes Topeka should fight for an affordable housing trust fund. And now I'd like to read her testimony. I have been a USD 501 Topeka Public Schools for over 28 years. I'm currently working at Robinson Middle School as a school social worker that helps at-risk students combat social factors in order to be successful in the classroom. Last year in 2015, I met a student who is having some trouble. I typically do home visits and activities that help me build relationships with students and families. This particular family had a grandmother, mother, and 3 children living in a 1-bedroom apartment. Grandma was ill and passed away last year. Mom works a minimum wage job and relies on public transportation to get around town. When I visited the home, it made me feel sick. The unit was infested with bed bugs and cockroaches, and I could tell Mom was embarrassed. She said that the landlord put a clause on in the rental agreement that the tenant was responsible for getting rid of pests. So Mom had to go to Payday Lending Institution and borrow $500 to get rid of the bed bugs and cockroaches. And you know how that story goes. I went into the restroom during my visit and found that the flooring around the toilet was dry rotted, and you could literally see the apartment beneath them. They are connected to 4 other units who share water and heat and bed bugs. The rent is due at the first of the month, and that is when Mom gets paid, the first of the month. She takes a picture of the money order and sends it to the landlord and then puts it in the mail. This landlord lives out of town. One time, since a check did not arrive on the 1st, he shut the water off for the weekend. All 4 units were without water for the weekend. This mom works full-time, making minimum wage. She pays more than 30% of her income on rent. Even with food assistance, the rest of her money does not cover her children's needs, such as toilet paper, shampoo, and clothing. You may wonder why this family just can't move elsewhere. Any decent alternative requires a deposit and first month's rent. This family does not have this kind of money. Anyone who's willing to cut you a break is offering the same kind of living conditions. Sheila says that she works with many families with similar stories. So she's challenging us tonight to stand together to fight for Affordable Housing Trust Fund, because there are little kiddos that walk into my school, her school, every day, living in unsafe conditions with barely enough to survive, and their lives are at stake. Thank you.
Okay, observations from that in relation to Nehemiah, in relation to what we're talking about?
First of all, I think, you could probably voice over that with Wilmington, Delaware.
Yes. Unfortunately, a lot of places you could. Now, you might have seen some of the, I think there was at least one housing price flashed up there, and just keep in mind, real estate prices are way cheaper out that way. But does not change the fact that that many people are not making enough to survive.
Yeah, this is Alan. Today I listened to and learned a lot about affordable housing in Wilmington. And for some, I've been doing the census, so I've been getting into all kinds of different parts of the city and seeing all kinds of living conditions that people are living in outside of my neighborhood. And one of the things I learned that we have 32,000 housing units in Wilmington, and over half of them are rentals. And there's a lot of problems in the communities where you have rentals. You have landlords who are just trying to maximize their profit off the property, and they do minimal, or they do, like you heard in that story, they require the tenant to take on responsibilities that you might think are landlord responsibilities. As a result, these areas that are heavily rented communities have a lot of other problems because of lack of home ownership. So there's movements like they're talking about here to address it, because a lot of people are paying, the average rent in Wilmington is like $1,100 a month for a similar apartment. But if you could get somebody the equity to be able to purchase the house, the cost of owning that house would be about $700 a month. So if you could transfer rentals into home ownership, you actually you lower the percent cost per month, but the issue is getting the initial equity. So I'm not sure if that's what their fund they were talking about was going to do, but there are efforts in Wilmington to create similar ideas where you help people get the equity or enter into rent to buy opportunities and things like this. Both ownership is a lower cost for them in the long run. It also allows them to build some wealth by owning a home. And they also find where they do this, it improves the neighborhood, because homeowners tend to care for their neighborhood differently than renters do. So just some things I learned today.
Right.
I'll say somewhat the same thing I said this afternoon, but is the voice of the church the voice of the oppressed? And do we live and act as Nehemiah?
Yeah, thank you for throwing that out there. It's definitely the relevant question for tonight. I've divided things out this way before. This is from that Micah verse, do justly, love mercy, walk humbly. Let's go right to left here, because these are three kind of distinct ways of thinking about our relationship with God. So starting with walk humbly, we think of that as our personal relationship with God. Our personal faithfulness is the word that Jesus used and all that comes with that. Love mercy. Doing mercy can be divided into at least two categories. One is meet immediate needs, or the part of that Chinese proverb that says, give a man a fish and he eats for a day. Another part is empowerment, empowering people to be more able to be self-sustaining and self-determining. That is perhaps teaching a man to fish, as in that Chinese proverb. But as I often say, the Chinese proverb doesn't go far enough, because you have to check the pond. And if there's no fish to catch for one reason or another, or only a few people have all the fish.
Or
Then
there's a fence
mercy,
around the pond.
I'm sorry.
There's a fence around the pond.
Yeah, right. An all number of things you could do with the analogy, right? Or there's a fence around the pond, or the owner of the pond won't let you in. That mercy is not enough. Now, it's not. There's nothing bad or substandard or non-biblical about mercy. I mean, gosh, how often does the Bible talk about mercy, and how often does it talk about meeting immediate needs and empowering people? There's a lot of examples of that. But we have to learn to think about how we sometimes try to meet mercy problems, or excuse me, justice problems with mercy solutions. One of the examples I often think about is with health and health care. If you look at the stats for sites like GoFundMe, somewhere around 30%, I think it is, 30% of GoFundMe campaigns are for medical bills. And now it's a ministry of mercy to help someone with outstanding medical bills that they cannot pay. But the mercy ministry, even though very much needed, does not address the root problem and does not check the pond. Same thing. You can help someone clean up a place that they live in. You could do a number of things to help to meet immediate needs, or maybe even try to empower. But the pond is pretty scarce if there's really no way that they in their current situation can get a job that pays a living wage, or go get an education where they could get a better job, get more qualified to do something. So often it requires resources that you don't have, and it comes back to the pond of what are people paid, and are full-time workers paid enough to live on? Now, this all sounds very policy heavy, perhaps political. I don't know how it sounds, but remember my point from last week. The Bible talks about this kind of practical stuff. I mean, Nehemiah was dealing with this kind of stuff. The Bible talks about bribery. It talks about wage theft. It talks about all of these things where people are being harmed or disadvantaged due to no fault of their own. And that's where justice comes in. Whenever you're being disadvantaged or harmed due to no fault of your own. That's doing justice, and that's what Nehemiah was doing. And for me, it was always powerful to be involved in a public meeting where we were amplifying voices, where we were telling stories. And I still remember the front row. Down on the front row, there were a number of city staff and the mayor, right? And in a room of more than 1,000 people, the mayor and others, and people from I think people from the Housing Authority, and people who years ago had agreed to do the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, they just never implemented it, were there listening to these stories, captive audience, listening to these stories. And the wisdom of Nehemiah's story is that, if we recognize that God doesn't want people to suffer, pretty simple proposition there. To love your neighbor means, in part, to try to alleviate their suffering and help them be able to be self-sustaining and self-determining. Nehemiah realized that this was not going to get fixed until they did this gathering where it was visible, it was audible, the people who could do something about it were there and asked to make a commitment to do something about it. So it's going beyond, for me, it's going beyond thinking of loving your neighbor as the more simple things that are easier to do, that are not as hard to think about and wrap our minds around. Just being kind to someone in a number of ways. Those kinds of things we can do. This kind of love that, it says in the book of Amos, God demands. He's like, do away with your worship if you're not going to do justice. That's what Amos says. Just quit making songs. Quit making songs if you're not going to do justice and love your neighbor in this way. So a question that I just want you to leave you to think about, because we're out of time for any more discussion, is, so all three of Micah's trio are important: justice, mercy, and walking humbly. Think about how can we take some of the walking humbly and loving mercy that we're already doing as individuals or a church and add a justice component. We love on some of our homeless friends and feed them. What would it look like to continue to push to add a justice component to what we do? We work with work with the ladies at New Expectations. The mission trips and the mission involvement that we've had, and the disaster relief and all of that. Think about what it might mean to at least add a justice component, push on the justice edge in some of these areas where we work. Talking about checking the pond and removing barriers that are being placed in front of people through no fault of their own. Any last minute comments?
Just a reminder, same time next week, we'll be doing a creation justice study. Slightly different perspective, but same idea.
Looking forward to that. Thank you for the reminder. All right, let us close in prayer. God, thank you once again for your word, for the privilege and opportunity of studying it, for the challenging call that you've placed upon our lives, to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, to amplify voices, to love our neighbor through all of the ways that you've called us, to alleviate suffering, to show people that we care, to help by the side of the road, but to also put our own skin in the game. So God, we thank you for this story of Nehemiah. We thank you for the example of people that you have raised up in many cities across this country, who are already in the trenches doing this work, speaking up for the justice of your kingdom and learning to love our neighbor as ourselves even more. Thanks for each person here and the time they gave to this and what they contributed. Be with us as we go forward in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, thank you once again. We'll be on for prayer gathering here in just a moment.